Restarting. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. If you are here, hopefully you're in the right room, we are here to talk about the housing production strategies, which is a relatively new requirement in state land use law that passed as part of House Bill 2003 in the 2019 legislative session. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities, where I lobby on all things housing, land use development related. And I have here with me today a panel of city planning directors and DLCD to talk about what a housing production strategy is. And these three gentlemen have their cities and communities adopted early housing production strategies. So most of the cities that are required to do these are either just in the process or just starting or will in the next couple of years. Everyone's kind of on a schedule now. And Ethan's going to get into specifics about how that works. But these communities did it early. So wanted to give you some concrete examples of what that looks like and then get your questions and also focus on the role of affordable housing developers and partners in these local regional conversations about housing production strategies. So with me today, we have Nick Sneed, the planning director from the city of Madras, Steve Koper from the city of Tualatin, Dustin Nielsen from the city of Hood River, and then Ethan Stuckmayer, who is the senior planner of housing programs at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So I'm going to turn it over to Ethan to give you a full explanation. But before I do, quick show of hands, who here feels like they know what a housing production strategy is and they're really in tune with the details? Okay, some of you. Who here doesn't really know what a housing production strategy is? Great. So we've got a whole range of expertise. So we'll be sure to try and break down any acronyms, and use acronyms and certain things. But I want to encourage the audience to raise your hand if we don't stay true to that. And I will try and interrupt if that happens. I'm also going to interrupt if people are talking too long, because no one on this panel has ever done that. So, but yeah, raise your hand, and we hope to leave plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. So I will be going around with a microphone, and we really want you to be able to ask your questions, and we'll go from there. So I'll turn it over to Ethan.
Thank you, Ariel. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a reminder, my name is Ethan Stuckmayer. I'm the Senior Housing Planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Acronym there, DLCD. So if I do say that, I apologize, but at least we got that definition out of the way. So today we'll talk about, I'm going to start this conversation with a little bit of context about just what DLCD does, and more specifically, what Goal 10 housing means and the housing production strategy system itself. So first, the Department of Land Conservation and Development regulates local governments' compliance with the statewide planning goals. There are 19 of those. There's the city folks, the local government folks here to talk about how they operate within that system, especially related to housing. I would say in comparison to other elements of the housing or the statewide planning system, housing is one that is, I would say, fairly regulated, and these guys can say yes or no to that when they're speaking. But Goal 10 housing is basically I would say kind of a lofty goal about how we provide housing for all folks in the state of Oregon. So the language of Goal 10 here is kind of at the bottom. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but its basic premise is we're talking about providing for the housing needs of citizens for the state. That includes having capacity of land to accommodate future growth. It includes units and the number and price range of those units to actually accommodate the folks who are trying to live in those units, and then flexibility of that housing in terms of its location, type, and density. So that sets the frame for how cities go about the process of fulfilling the intent, that lofty intent of Goal 10. And so here's how that's kind of done, and I apologize that's showing up really terribly on the projector here, but this is, I would classify as kind of the old pre-House Bill 2003 housing planning framework. So it kind of flows from the population projection that's actually produced by the Population Research Center at the Portland State University. Basically, that gives cities a number to strive for in terms of their population over a 20-year period. And then from there, cities project that housing need based on household size and expected growth over time. Cities have, the statute and the rules around how cities do this Goal 10 process really focuses in on the land capacity, not so much on meeting housing need in terms of its actual, characteristics, in terms of housing type, in terms of density, in terms of price ranges and rent levels. So as you can see in this slide, it really kind of highlights that we're really focusing in on land and land capacity. So cities do this inventory of that buildable land, basically calculate how much housing or how many folks we can house on the land that's within an urban growth boundary. And then there are some expectations in terms of what cities do with that number. It's basically kind of a calculus exercise. You kind of work backwards, and it's really math heavy and population projections and estimates and so on and so forth. And then cities are expected to take some actions to accommodate that needed housing through policy decisions, upzoning, efficiency measures, so on and so forth. That's kind of how it exists today. And there are some, I would say, elements of that process that lead to less than desirable outcomes. So why should a city conduct this process, right? There's a need for affordable housing. Obviously, we know that, and the need for that affordable housing is enormous in the state. I have a slide later that shows, kind of breaks that down in what the actual need is across the state. But housing planning really builds on the other things that the city is doing to set the table for housing development. These can include, just from a high-level planning perspective, in terms of doing a housing needs analysis or a housing capacity analysis, estimating that housing need over time, but it also can kind of parlay with things like system development charge and fees and structures and other elements of city regulations that set the table for housing. And then, of course, this process is required for cities, and there's a long list of statute and administrative rules that kind of set that process for cities. So right, yeah, so all cities within the state have to do this kind of housing planning, but for the housing production strategy specifically, the HPS, cities over a population 10,000 are required to do that. And we'll get into the details on that a little bit. But I wanted to show this slide here because we know that the need for affordable housing is massive in the state. And this is an analysis that was actually conducted by OHCS and Echo Northwest that show that the state over the next 20 years needs to accommodate 584,000 units. And the current deficit, or the shortfall that currently exists today, is close to 111,000 units. So there's an incredible amount of housing is necessary. We need to be doing everything that we can to actually achieve the production that's necessary to house those folks. And I think what's really kind of important to highlight on this slide is that this housing need is broken down by family and affordability level, basically. And so 46% of those 584,000 units over the next 20 years will require at least some level of public subsidy to come to fruition, which is, I think, pretty concerning. All right, so jumping into how cities do this and what is housing need and what's measured. So like I mentioned, the housing planning system that currently exists or existed prior to House Bill 2003 was really, again, focused on that land, the capacity of the land to accommodate future growth, right? That was the primary element of the housing capacity analysis. And that analysis included some element of estimating housing affordability and housing need based on income levels and what people could actually afford. And it also included those kind of unique needs. So things like various household sizes, the number of bedrooms necessary in those units, included the location of those housing units in relation to services, employment, and schools. But those elements, I think, and I think folks would agree, that those elements were secondary to the estimation of land need and land capacity. And that creates a lot of really bad outcomes in terms of how you plan for housing over a 20-year period, because you're not taking into account those really unique circumstances about those location and the cost it takes to access transportation to your home. Those things aren't necessarily included in that calculation in the current system, or I guess the old system at this point. But cities can take steps to, again, set the table for housing development and achieve the outcomes that we really do strive to achieve in terms of meeting the intent of Goal 10. Price levels and rent prices and rent levels that people can afford. The diversity of housing in terms of its type and density and location. There are things cities can do to set the table for those kind of outcomes to come through, even though you're talking about land capacity kind of at the high level. So of course, this graphic is, if you've been following along with housing policy at all, you may have seen this graphic. This one, it comes from Echo Northwest. It's a graphic that they use often, but it kind of highlights this interconnectedness of all these different elements and these levers that cities and local governments and state governments can pull to actually see development of housing, and the development of housing that meets the needs of a community. So things like public policy, market feasibility, capital, land, all of these things need to kind of match up so that we can actually see the development of housing. In cities, in the case of cities, they can kind of pull the levers on 3 of those things. That includes public policy, land and infrastructure, and capital to some extent, but not really so much on the market feasibility. But if you can pull 3 of those, you can probably estimate or make those decisions based on that 4th one, on that market feasibility. So the expectation, I think, as we're kind of moving into this post House Bill 2003 housing production strategy kind of paradigm, is that we're expecting cities to do all of the things that they can, use all of the tools at their disposal to make sure that those 3 elements, those 3 circles of the Venn diagram that are within their control, actually produce the units that are necessary. And that's where the housing production strategy program really comes into play. So you might remember that first old Goal 10 framework diagram. This is the new Goal 10 framework diagram, which includes that housing production strategy on the end of this process, right? So House Bill 2003, passed in 2019, requires cities with a population over 10,000 to basically set forth a game plan, a set of actions that they'll implement over the course of 6 years if that city is within the Portland metro boundary, or within the next 8 years if that city is outside of the Portland metro boundary, to actually achieve and facilitate the production of the housing that's been identified in their housing production strategy. So basically, it's asking the cities to describe what they're going to do, what meaningful actions they're going to take to actually meet that housing need that they've identified in their housing capacity analysis. So what is included in a housing production strategy report? Well, a lot of things. And that's really important because we know that the existing system doesn't include a lot of these elements. And so, like I mentioned before, a housing production strategy is that 6 or 8 year game plan that identifies strategies to meet a city's housing needs, both in terms of the near term and the long term. So on the far left, we're talking about what is the actual housing need? And we're asking cities to go further than what they typically have done in terms of a housing capacity analysis, right? The housing capacity analysis is basically a formula that describes the amount of land that's necessary. That's an important element, right? We live in a state that does growth management planning at a high level in terms of how it's closely regulated, and that land capacity is really important in terms of housing need. However, there are other elements of housing need that aren't incorporated in that land process. Things like the amount of housing that's needed for people experiencing homelessness today, the amount of second and vacation homes that city is experiencing if it's on the coast, Central Oregon, in the Gorge. Those are all key elements to actually producing the amount of housing that's necessary to meet the need in the community. So we call that kind of section the contextualized housing need. go beyond your analysis of your land capacity, incorporate other elements so you can get to that kind of true housing need in your community. In addition to that, city planners are really good at doing that planning and estimating what that housing need if they have the numbers, but it's really important to have that conversation with the stakeholders, the people on the ground, about what are the city planners missing in terms of the housing need. Are there particular elements of a housing need that aren't captured in any of those kind of three elements up above? And pairing that further contextualizes the housing need in a local community in terms of having the conversations with the folks on the ground who are experiencing the difficulty that actually exists in terms of finding housing. So both of those two things together establish your housing need. And then the city can kind of move forward into developing the strategies that it's kind of considering in their housing production strategy. So this process includes, we've got this kind of long list of over 10 or 110 kind of housing production strategies that we've been able to kind of group think about and hive think about, and we've produced that in a resource, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But that gives cities a place to start in terms of, how do we go about, what are the options available to us, and how do we actually go about meeting that housing need? So that's kind of a starting place, but of course there's opportunity for local kind of innovation and customization of those strategies that really meet the context of those of the people in the community. There's an evaluation process of all of those housing production strategies collectively and how they address fair and equitable housing outcomes. There's 6 of those that are established in rules. It's location of housing and kind of carbon, greenhouse gas emissions. There's fair housing. There's home ownership and affordable rental. There's housing stability. And I'm forgetting the 6th one. I apologize. It'll come to me in a bit. But they have to kind of use those fair and equitable housing outcomes as a lens to think about their housing production strategy holistically to ensure that they're achieving or striving or making progress towards those equitable outcomes. So after that long, process takes place, the city would submit or complete or adopt or pass that housing production strategy at the local level, and then it's time for implementation. So then cities spend kind of 6 or 8 years working through that implementation process and making sure that they're kind of taking action on either those particular strategies or establishing Plan B so that they can still address that particular housing need. So this is I talked about this just a little bit ago. These are kind of the categories or the prompts or the resource that the state has provided in terms of the various types of housing production strategies themselves. And you'll notice that, DLCD is a planning agency, right? And we focus, our domain is land use, zoning, and urban growth boundaries, right? And cities have that responsibility as well. However, you'll see that's only one of the 6 categories here. We're asking cities, the housing production strategy process goes above and beyond just the zoning and land use issues related to residential development, and ask cities to consider things like reducing those regulatory impediments, financial incentives. How can you pull, tax exemption and abatement into the conversation so you can actually meaningfully move the needle in housing production? And then these, housing production strategies will vary based on the local government, right? They've got their housing need that's been identified in their housing capacity analysis. It's been contextualized through conversations with stakeholders and local partners. And then it's up to the city to determine which strategies are going to be the most effective in meeting that housing need, right? And the state is not prescribing which housing production strategies they're choosing, which particular strategies they're choosing. It's up to the local government to decide, hey, should we try for land banking? Should we go for a general obligation bond? Should we try for, just doing a code audit? Those individual decisions will be up to the individual local governments to decide based on their housing needs. So it is kind of this menu of options that's, we're setting the stage for cities to make the right decisions for themselves. And of course, there are kind of less impactful and more impactful elements of that housing production strategy. So what are the city's commitments in terms of submitting a housing production strategy, right? So your commitment, a city's commitment, first and foremost, is to addressing the housing, the entirety of the housing need that has been identified. The expectation is not that the city is going to necessarily meet the entirety of its housing need. We know that cities do not build housing for the most part, and that the actions that they take is the most important part. They should be taking meaningful action to addressing the housing need in total, but they're not their commitment isn't to any particular strategy. It's a commitment to addressing the need, right? And so that's an important element of the housing production strategy. There's all sorts of options for cities to say, we thought we could go for, say, like a voter-approved bond measure, right? And they go to the ballot and that fails, right? That doesn't mean that the city needs to be penalized for not achieving that because it's out of their control. However, they do need to submit kind of a plan B. What else are you going to do to meet that need that you've identified as part of that housing production strategy? So I think that's a general overview of the housing production strategy process, but I wanted to ask if there's any questions. I see Ariel wants to add something maybe. Okay. Pause for questions. Yes.
I was wondering if there's any part of the analysis or the production strategy that looks at the workforce needed both throughout the ecosystem, right, of creating all of this housing. So some types of work may not need as much training to get up to speed to be able to develop these things or manage those assets. And I didn't know if there was any part of the analysis that looks at the workforce needed to support the production strategy. And if there is, who does it? And can I have their phone number? Yeah.
You want to handle this?
Go for it. Well, it's a good question because we have these goals, these housing goals, right? And we're estimating over a 20-year period for housing need. And the housing production strategy program is intended to not just be about the outcome or the actual meeting the targets that we've got, but making progress towards the outcomes. And I think using that lens to think about the housing production strategy program in itself, there are all sorts of things that we can include as a housing production strategy. So like workforce training at the high school could be a housing production strategy because you're increasing the capacity of your community to meet the housing need, right? And so, those particular elements are, I wouldn't say, necessarily part of a response in a housing production strategy, but it could be. And the options are really available to the city to, make the case for which strategies are addressing their housing need in the long run.
And I would just add too, from the city's perspective, and I'm sure the planning directors can get into it in their portion, but it was designed and part of the work or the rulemaking process was what's within the city's control. What are the levers the city can pull or attempt to pull at the ballot? Some of those things are in partnership, right? So I think you'll hear more about kind of the community engagement process of the housing production strategy, where I think some of those tangential in partnership strategies will probably come up, but they're less part of maybe the formal DLCD directed portion, if that makes sense. So I see a bunch of questions.
What are we?
Yeah, can you guys do like 2 minutes or less on each of yours, and then we could do all the questions? What do you think?
I'm the one that's chronically guilty of overrunning this, so we'll see what we can do.
Let's do a few more questions and then we'll get to you guys. So I know Joel was next.
Great, thank you.
Joel Madsen, everyone.
Thank you, Dustin. And I do work in Dustin's community, so I'm excited about this presentation. I know that there were some discussions in the rulemaking around, how can we work together to advance equity, and knowing that how the housing system is just rooted in inequities. And I'm just curious your thought about how do we leverage this to really come together and advance equity throughout the state of Oregon, particularly as it relates to housing planning, housing production?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think there for a really long time, the land use planning system has been around for 50 years next year. And that process hasn't really held itself accountable to achieving those kind of equitable outcomes for a really, really long time. And I think, that's changing. We're starting to put some of those structural processes and establishing outcomes, identifying those, outlining the expectations of local governments into things like administrative rule, into statute. But I think it takes a lot of work at the local government level to have those conversations with the stakeholders who are most important in that regard. And we as a state agency can really provide either guidance, support in terms of funding or technical guidance. But I think it does speak to a change in, just the regulatory environment in terms of let's focus on the outcomes and let's focus less on the process and like how you do the math, and let's focus more on, what are we actually achieving when we're going through the housing planning process.
Okay, we're going to take a couple more questions, and I want to make sure we get to hear from the practitioners from the cities.
Hi, Kevin Kellogg, Gorman and Company. My question was about one of your circles that had capital in it. And the question is, and I followed along the process of the rulemaking and so forth, and it was amazing. But one thing I never saw really was financial modeling, or at least macro level modeling, sources of capital and capacity of the state to finance the amount of housing that probably will be recommended coming out of this. Can you give us a little more backstory on how you were thinking of the resources that would be needed to accomplish this?
Yeah, so back in 2020, when we were doing this rulemaking, the focus was how do we set the process for cities to make the decisions that are going to be most impactful in meeting their housing needs. And that what was paramount in that process was that the local governments should be the ones that are making the decisions on which housing production strategies they're going to be implementing. And so in the process of establishing things like those fair and equitable housing outcomes, things like what it means to contextualize your housing need, there wasn't a whole lot of financial modeling, because I think that the expectation, at least right now, is that cities will be making those decisions on their own behalf. So they'll be doing that kind of local analysis of things like pro forma, market of feasibility, what can the city actually do in terms of financing and providing financial incentives to the development of housing. And so the state was kind of taking hey, let's set the parameters and then let the cities do that analysis on their own behalf.
Hello, I'm Mercedes. I'm from Central City Concern. My question is about, other than kind of an oversight function, what is the state's role in helping cities to achieve those goals? I think capital is, one question, but we also every once in a while come up against something and they're like, that's a state regulation or state limitation. So what are the ways in which there's like a proactive engagement from the state to help achieve those goals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this speaks to the ongoing work that the state at large, that I'm not, DLCD is doing a lot, but OHCS, Business Oregon, ODOT are all doing lots of great things in terms of removing some of those, barriers, or identifying them early and being proactive about that. And one of the things that, this is a separate process called the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis that we're kind of working on, that would kind of modernize the system maybe a little bit more. But one of the key elements of that is that the state would be kind of a coordinating body and a more proactive element in the housing planning process, so that cities aren't the only ones doing this, right? There are so many other levels of government that can play a role in that. And actually, almost 600,000 units is going to take all of us to achieve. So the state, being less of a reactionary and, waiting for somebody to say, hey, this barrier exists, and kind of trying to identify those before and being proactive about that is a key element of how we go forward from here.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, and then we will come back for more questions after we hear from the other panelists.
Thank you. Just to echo on her concern, my question is, as a taxpayer and we don't see these things being happen, although you guys are saying you're doing wonderful things, but if you go outside, it's not happening. So there's some land that nobody's using it. Why not give it to community so you can have a community garden, or you can have something instead of just being occupied, and it's becoming a hazard problem in the future. Just an suggestion.
Yeah, I think the thing that is really tough with planning is that it's so, I mean, we're talking about 20-year housing needs, right? And there are people who are struggling to find housing right now, today, as we sit here. So the process that the state is undertaking is hoping to set the stage for that kind of thing to happen. That's not the only thing that we're working on, right? In terms of how we attack and address this crisis and, try to really make progress on it. It does take setting the stage at the local level, setting the stage at the regional level, setting the stage at the state level, so that those kind of things, like a land bank process at the local level, using surplus lands, can actually happen, easier, quicker, more effectively. And then it takes funding. It takes prioritization at the local level. It takes prioritization at the state level and leadership to actually see those things and progress on the ground. It's kind of you do the planning, and then you do the investment, you do the prioritization, you take the actions. So it is kind of it's all necessary. And this is one small element of it. And I recognize that it is not, any kind of like panacea in terms of housing production. It's going to take some time to see the fruits of this work on the long haul, but then there's other things we can do today to actually, see those units come to development today. So it takes both the long-term and the short-term prioritization, I guess.
Thanks, Ethan. We're going to move on to the panelists real quick here. I'm going to grab my phone so I can keep track of the time. All right, so we just have a little bit of time left to get through some slides, but you'll get some local context for kind of the specific, what does this look like specifically on the ground?
All right, well, thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to be presenting before you. I'm Steve Koper. I'm the Assistant Community Development Director for the City of Tualatin. For those of you that don't know, Tualatin is about 10 miles of here south, just along I-5, a community of about 27,000. It is also a high employment community. We swell to about as many full-time employees during a given workday. So how Tualatin arrived at being an early adopter for this housing production strategy project started out in 2018. We had direction from our council and support for our community to study the problem of lack of affordable housing, like all communities across the state, but especially felt in the Portland metropolitan area. And so our staff put together a project that we called Tualatin 2040. The cornerstones of that project were community outreach, a lot of involvement, including practitioners from the affordable housing community, other stakeholders, just simply individuals, low-income renters, and so forth. And then the work products that came out of that, or as Ethan showed on the previous slide, housing capacity analysis, or also known as a housing needs analysis, and a buildable lands inventory. We also were fortunate enough to have done some early housing contextualization, wherein we had some strategic actions that came along, narrative actions that came along with the data itself, and kind of provided some early indications of how we might take action in the future to address these needs. And so this kind of all gelled together. We adopted our Tualatin 2040 work in 2019. I don't know the exact timeline, but House Bill 2003 was about the same time. And so because we had basically done the early groundwork of some of the housing contextualization by doing our outreach, and then just fresh off of doing a housing capacity analysis, and the fact that thanks to DLCD, there was money in the form of grants available for us to do this work, of course, we raised our hand to participate in, be one of the early communities for housing production strategy. And so again, in the goals for our community of joining and adopting a housing production strategy were to identify goals and strategic actions that the city could take to address the housing needs that we had previously identified through our H&A and through our strategic policy actions that the council had adopted. I heard a lot of good comments in the question so far, and I'll try to address some of those because they're, I think, answered within our housing needs analysis. And I really just love the way that people are thinking about this problem, and I think it's really great. And I'll just say that, you know, we're city planners, we're bureaucrats, we love a plan, and I think that city councils love a plan and need a plan. And I think that the last gentleman that spoke, his question regarding like what are we doing now is a great question, and I think that just kind of in telling the story of like we started this in 2018 and really starting in 2018 kind of sells it short. This had been brewing for even longer than that. I mean, you know, and here we are 4 years later and we're still working away on this process. I mean, to get to on the ground right now, we have to have a really long runway and a really long ramp to get up to it. So I just want to clarify that. So we did adopt our housing production strategy. So some of the positive outcomes of adopting a housing production strategy, just for example, and this goes to the gentleman's question about equity, is we specifically had a goal in our housing production strategy around equity, and we have actually leveraged that to embark on a further work effort out of this plan to do an equitable strategic financial plan where we're studying various types of financial tools that we can use to help support affordable housing in our community. And so that is something that is really important. And again, these ideas have swirled around and we've gotten pressed on them before, but having them in a plan that council blessed, that council adopted, gives us great cover and gives us great opportunity to go forward with this work and be able to basically point to it and see, this is what you wanted and this is what we're doing. And so it's really great for us as practitioners, because I think that, and this goes to the point of what can you all do to help us, is that, you know, we can only do so much. And then the other point, just as far as like positives out of the adoption of a housing production strategy, is that we also had identified as a potential strategy to adopt the low-income affordable housing rental tax exemption for local property tax in Tualatin. And we had actually pushed this idea prior to adoption of the plan with our finance department, and the response had been really lukewarm up until that point. But once we got it adopted in the housing production strategy, bingo bango, the finance department got right on it. And as of last month, it got adopted into our municipal code. So again, the power of having things in a plan for cities is really big. I can't emphasize that enough. And then a couple of other comments just as far as the workforce housing comments. So Ariel, I think, nailed it there. We're looking in a lot of these goals and strategies in our housing production strategy, we're looking for partnership. And so we're looking for a partnership with our employment community to understand what the workforce needs are and how we can actually help them produce that product. Because although there are 3 levers that we can pull on, I mean, really policies are a big one. I mean, without some additional financial supports for a community of our size, and I know Nick's and Dustin's are smaller even still. So, I mean, that's not really something we have a whole lot of control over. And then I guess just my final takeaways and wrap-ups as far as what we could ask from you as practitioners in the affordable housing development community is partner with us. I think a couple of takeaways is that, you know, if you work in a community that you're not familiar with the council and planning commission and folks like that, get to know them, get on a council session and just get, you know, open mic public testimony, just introduce yourselves and let them know who you are and what you do. Because if an opportunity comes up, the fact that you'd have built that relationship really pays dividends in the future. And I can tell you, we have an affordable housing project under the Metro bond that's going on right now. Is with Community Partners for Affordable Housing, and they really did that. They got into the community. They participated early in our Tualatin 2040 on the Community Advisory Committee and got themselves forming a relationship with staff and the council and so forth. And that's the other piece, is they get to know the staff. I know these guys, and I know everyone that I know and talks to realizes the dire nature of this crisis and wants to help. And so help us help you and be advocates. And then the last thing I'd say just on the advocacy piece is testify. Even if it's a small project, even if it's a slam dunk, a no-brainer, testify on it. It helps decision makers feel good about their decision making, and it helps them do it again in the future. Yeah, and with that, unless there's any direct questions for me, I'll turn it over to Nick now.
Terrific. Thanks, Steve. Great comments there. What I want to talk about is Madras' needs, as Steve kind of talked about Tualatin's problem, how we have a housing problem that didn't start, 2 years ago. It actually started back in 2013, 14, 15, as our community was slowly, very slowly coming out of the 08, 09 recession, and other areas in the Central Oregon region were building housing, having lots of economic development. And so it was in 2017 that we were also blessed with a nice grant from DLCD to develop a housing action plan. And I'll put a pin on something I think is really important. It's a non-regulatory plan. So it's not necessarily tied to our comprehensive plan. It's not necessarily under the purview of DLCD. It was also developed before this idea of a housing production strategy was codified in statute and rule, or passed by the legislature. So we wanted the ability to really understand the needs of our community for housing. So we took the time to do that. And oh, by the way, this legislation passed, it happens to require a lot of the same things. So what is it? What do we have or had in Madras? 32% of our households are cost burden. Between 2010 and 17, just 49 new dwelling units of any type. We have, if you can believe the number, 105 people experiencing homelessness. I would say that's probably more. And then as you break down the housing need by income level, 401 people are needing housing that earn less than $25,000 a year. And these are 2017 numbers. And then another staggering number, 435 units are needed for people earning $50,000 to $100,000. In a small rural community, those are big numbers. And so one of the things that we started to kind of look at is how do we be responsive to that? And so to Steve's point, we asked our stakeholders. We needed the Affordable Housing Authority to come in and tell us what they needed. We needed the for-profit developers to come in and really listen and understand. So as I look down these sorts of things, our housing action plan does look at the demographics. It does have a market conditions analysis. We do identify the barriers. We do identify the needs. We didn't address homelessness so much, and we don't address the need for disability. But I can tell you this 5-year plan that we've adopted, those will be addressed here soon. So graphically speaking, you can see over from 2009 to 17, if it wasn't for a regional housing authority building 24 units of subsidized housing, we had pretty meager production. And so the first horizontal line, for those of you in the back, is the template created some pretty small numbers. The first line is 5. So, in most years, we're not even constructing 5 units a year. So meager production. And so that's also to say that regional housing authorities can't also solely be providing your affordable housing in your community. You need other providers. So again, in 2017, our council said, "Hey, bring us this plan." And so we also made a distinct choice as a staff, and I think also as a planning commission and council, to look at income as a way to target our strategy to build more housing in our community, because we didn't think that just specifying the number of dwelling units on a piece of property was sufficient enough. In other words, we didn't need to say. We didn't think it was appropriate to say, "Oh, we need 200 units of multifamily." Well, there's all different types of multifamily, and so you could be led astray there. So overall, we have a plan that says we need to build 33 units of housing just to move forward with growth. That doesn't address that backlog where you had over 10 years of just basically no production. So 33 units a year, broken down by income type. And so as we start implementing that plan immediately, we started moving on the bright and shiny objects that the home builders would like. So we immediately cut our SDCs by 25% for all housing. For workforce housing, as defined by 120 to 60% of AMI, we reduced SDCs by 50%, and then all multifamily, regardless if it's subsidized or not, 75% reduction there. We also developed a pretty innovative tool, our Housing Urban Renewal District. It's a 700-acre district, which encompasses basically most of our undeveloped large tracts of land, but then also some funky old rural residential land that we had to annex. It used to be in the county, and you have some really funky kind of parcelization there, brought in all that land. That I can tell you is probably one of the most powerful tools that we have today. And I'll tell you that is in this housing production strategy, of all the things that I think is probably the most controversial, if it's not quite being discussed, is the money. Because Ethan said 46% of the states needed housing, it needs subsidy. Where do you get that subsidy? The state of Oregon can't do it. There's no knight in shining armor that's going to come rescue your city. So that means at local level, we have to do that. But when we talk about construction excise tax, raising fees and all these things, guess what? That's when you fill council chambers. So you have to get to some of these harder problems and really talk to people. As Steve said and others have talked about, get your stakeholders in the room and start building support early on so you can start to develop the revenue to offset the cost for your needed housing in your community. Of course, streamline your permitting process. I always, principle of economic development is capital goes where it's easy. The counter to that is, well, if there's a market and a dollar to be made, then people will have low patient capital. But in terms of housing, I think in the small rural communities in Oregon, the way we just slay the big cities is, it's good old fashioned customer service. You only talk to me. I'm going to see your project all the way through. You have a question, you contact me. I'll talk to the building official. I'll talk to Public Works, and we're going to figure this out. And guess what? They love it. So another great strategy there that doesn't necessarily get put in a housing production strategy, but that's mission, that's heart, that's fighting the mission there for housing your community. So as you kind of look forward, we implemented this plan in 2018. It was adopted in December 13th of 18. So we got a few years of data here. You can start to see some of the increase in production. So that's good. And the point of this is these policies work only if you're responding to the problems. Now, if I come back to you in 5 years, I'm going to tell you how much of the pandemic housing demands and changes there, and then also perhaps a recession is going to moderate this. But I still think that the SDC reductions and tax increment financing that we've implemented is going to save the day during these lower economic times. You're going to start to see housing being built where it wouldn't normally be. Kind of wrapping up. So how are we doing this? 4 years into this 5-year plan, I'd tell you, we are not doing well with subsidized housing. It's because of land assembly. We don't have any land. That's a big one. So I think our next housing plan update will deal with that. The state sandbox. For years, for over 30 years, the state of Oregon has prioritized traded sector jobs and given grants and loans to communities to build all that infrastructure to leverage all those jobs. Well, the planning profession has known for over 40 years there's a relationship between jobs and housing. So why aren't we taking some of that really precious money at DEQ, Business Oregon, building streets, building sewers, whatever it is, so we can have housing, someone can live in your community, but then also work there. I think there's a huge kind of retooling there, DLC, OHS, and Business Oregon, that could help us out there. And of course, tax credit funding, but that's kind of an easy one. I do think getting back to customer service, if you really need housing in your community, make it easier for people. We just did a huge code update adopting middle housing. It was effective middle of June, July this year. And sending a link to a developer saying, here's my codes, just make sure they're all clear and objective, trust me. Just make sure you meet them. It doesn't work. So what we've done is we've created just a checklist, all the standards. We identify which standards need to be met. So when that application comes back, I know what I've asked for. If they gave it to me, great. Very likely I'm going to approve it. So you really start to telegraph the expectations on your permitting. I haven't had feedback on that quite yet, but soon. My guess is it'll be appreciated. And then kind of just some final thoughts here. We're an early adopter. We did this not because of legislation, because it was needed at the local level. I think that, again, I'm saying this again, if you're talking in front of a city council or planning commission and you're serious about the problem, you really have to know the problem. So really starting getting and understand your market dynamics, the stakeholder needs, you can really start to develop a pretty successful plan that's going to be responsive. Revenue's darn important. I wish you all the best. I was lucky. And then of course, partnerships. So with that.
Thank you, Nick. Any specific questions for Madras before we go on to the third community? All right, and then,
Hi, Kim Travis, OHCS. Question for you, Nick. Nice to see you, first of all. How did you, so annexation, SDC reduction, and TIF are powerful tools that you've utilized. What kind of staffing levels, how did you implement those tools? How many staff do you have that were working on these strategies, or like consultants, and how did you pay for that?
Good question. Well, we didn't hire any more people. Echo Northwest was our contractor that did our housing action plan. We used Elaine Howard Consulting and Tiberius Solutions for the urban renewal work. Great folks. Nick Papanuk, just phenomenal guy. His urban renewal is very difficult and complex. But it really took our own staff that we already had. So city manager was actively involved. Same with the public works director, finance director, and then myself, a planner, someone that's working with public works, and we're working on it all together. No new staff, and so yeah, it was tough. It is tough, but we're also seeing the results.
did you get any grant resources from DLCD?
Yeah, so we got a grant to thank you. Create the plan, and then we also got a very substantial grant to do the code update, and so that was amazingly helpful. Yeah, and I'll actually be speaking in Pendleton on that work as well.
I just want to emphasize that state funding for the consultants to come in and help communities do these updates and do these strategies is a really critical part of this. All right, we're going to hand it over to Dustin in the city of Hood River, and then we will open it right back up for a robust discussion.
Robust. Thank you all for joining us after lunch. I'm going to go through this really quick. I get to go last, and there's a bit of karma because I'm chronically consuming everyone else's time. I love to do this. I love to talk to people about this. I think for you all, we can talk about the economics of this, but what we're talking about is community and people. This is housing for people. This is maintaining the community. I think what I try to end with, usually when I'm talking to kids or elected officials, which usually has like the same tenor, is for us and what kind of weighs on my heart as a bureaucrat here is I think about our community, and I mean that I live in Hood River. These are my friends. This is where my family is. What's at risk here is if we don't accomplish this, our community will unravel. We will lose it, and we will become nameless, faceless. The people that have lived there for generations long before us are really the most at risk. And I think I get a lot of flack about, why we don't need to grow. Why are we growing? The people that are coming to Hood River aren't at risk. It's the people that have lived there for, that first generation, farm families that don't own farms. They're the first out. They're the people that are really on the bubble right now, who've been on the bubble since forever. And I think, I put that, and I take this real serious. It's like, sometimes it feels like you're like the one thing that's like having them keep that foothold in this community and giving a little hope and giving a little voice to them. And I think if you carry that around, it's a burden, but it's also, it's what keeps small staffs moving. It's what keeps you out in the line of fire because you care about this. So, when your opportunity is presented, you show up. people don't rush down to City Hall because they're so in favor of something. They rush down to say no. And so if you feel like you're an advocate for people and you're an advocate for change, it can be really tough to be like, I'm so supportive, I'm going to show up and support this. So it's where being present and being heard. You're in positions of power, you have authority, you have agency over your life, you have expertise. Come down and support these initiatives if you want to see change. So that's my preamble. Also, none of these slides have anything to do with that. So let's do this. Let's get into this. I'm going to try to capture 50 years in a couple minutes. We've been talking about in Hood River about housing since our first comp plan and goal 10 analysis. We chronically show up as one of the top 10 most expensive places in the United States for living. We get sized up with Park City, Martha's Vineyard. So this is a serious issue, not only for those on the margins, but really for every industry. And we have gotten to the point now where we have industry partners. We have advocacy from every employment sector because this issue has gotten so acute that there is no industry that is unimpacted in Hood River. We have problems with engineers getting housing. We have problems with doctors. Providence Hospital is one of our partners because they see we cannot get doctors to live here. And it's gotten that bad. And if you let it get that bad, there is no agency that will be unimpacted. So our problem, we're in a wonderful place. We have an amazing urban growth boundary that maintains really some of the most high value farmland probably in the United States, at least in Oregon. And one of the hallmarks of the state's planning program is to protect farm and forest. So this wonderful place that we live, we have very little land to work with, and we have really little expectation that within the next quarter century, if ever, that we will ever be able to expand into it. It is not a responsive action to think about we will grow our way out of this. We have a hard time capturing multifamily housing and development. Just that capital aspect, that interest, and without that available land has made it difficult. And really, this has simply resulted in our housing affordability dropping over time, precipitous drops. Our housing needs analysis adopted in 2015 really laid out 3 strategies that we needed to work with. We needed to use our real estate that we had more efficiently. We needed to regulate and the secondary and short-term rental housing, and we needed to partner up and develop affordable housing. I'm going to jump right into the first thing that we adopted, short-term rental regulations. It's at the bottom. Our council leaned into that, knowing full well that if we continue to develop housing only to have it be siphoned off into a short-term rental market, that we would never outgrow it. And the appetite for short-term rentals in our area is insatiable. Affordable housing will not compete with that money. And so we put it on first. It addresses demand, it addresses supply, it addresses preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing that you will never be able to recreate at this cost. And it was a bloodbath. And I have to honor my my officials for leaning into that, because it really divided the community. And as a result, we were one of the first communities to step out and regulate that. We've managed to really hold pace and actually reduce the number of short-term rentals in our area. And those units have gone onto the market for long-term, probably long-term rentals, but it is no coincidence. That is the first thing we dealt with as one of the places to get a foothold and to manage what we had in place, rather than not only to lose housing. We didn't want to lose any more housing that we already had. You can see a little slide here. This was 51. We had 51 units, so we have about 4,000 dwelling units. In 2004, there was about 50 short-term rentals that jumped in 4 years that jumped 400%. And we will now today, probably next year, we will see probably a drop in 50% of that. So bringing it not only in check, but also really seeing those units return to market just by regulating it. And really the hallmark of what we do is it has to be your primary residence to rent. We don't allow spec passive income In our residential zones, it's your primary house and it gives you opportunity to get a license. Then we moved on. Let's see. We were one of the first communities to adopt a construction excise tax. Really what we wanted to do is capture the momentum of the market. This way we use these funds, which is basically a percentage on the value of a construction permit, to buy land. We bought real estate based on these future incomes, and we bought it specifically to build affordable housing. We were one of the first communities to adopt a middle housing code. We purchased more real estate. We cut parking mandates for the redevelopment of historic housing. We were one of the first communities to update its ADU codes, and at some point we were the largest per capita ADU manufacturer or producer in the state, even over Portland. And we started looking at other ways, expanding our utility income assistance, and really then getting into the development of affordable housing. This is a project I wanted to highlight, Rand Road. This is what we bought with our CET money. This project is waiting for additional capital, but it was purchased by the city and set aside with a purchase option to develop affordable housing. Here we're back to our Venn diagram. I like to call the diagram, housing development is hard, affordable housing is really hard. Only those projects that make it in the center mass there are those projects that get built. So as Ethan talked about, we need to understand as a city, what are the levers that we have to pull? How do we expand that middle section when really a small fish, we don't have access to capital. We don't have the funds on our own to build this. So we better be looking at, and a lot of times we don't have market feasibility. So we better be looking at land, and we better be looking at the public policy and the process that we put these folks through to see these projects become reality.
Dustin, how many more slides do you have?
2 more.
Okay. You're at time.
All right. You've seen this, we talked about it. We'll jump right to the last one. When we developed our affordable housing production strategy, and again, it was based exclusively on affordable housing. We did a housing needs analysis, but we understood that, that the difficulties and the challenges of building what was truly affordable really expands past the market's readiness. So what we did is we put together a short list of what we thought were real manageable projects within a program. We thought about how many people we had to operate this thing, how many staff did we have, and how much bang for the buck did we get? Was the juice worth the squeeze? I'm the same guy who comes up with these policies and manages them for 20 years. I'm the same person who manages your neighbor's fence issue. So thinking about how much time we had to dedicate this and how much really we could get out of this was really important to us. So as Nick had mentioned, urban renewal right on top. It's a stated, it's a way to use your police powers to develop and acquire land. It's a way to develop and raise capital on the local level. It's a way to get into development agreements with folks. It's on top. Establish nonprofit tax exemptions. Second reading was on Monday. Affordable housing ordinance, that's a process improvement that de-weaponizes the land use planning program that those in power seem to readily exploit to the demise of affordable housing. I love the partition that's downstairs. Land banking, I have no real estate. When it becomes available, I better buy it and I better be set up to be competitive. Project subsidies that lean towards really making new construction more affordable. I can't make 2x4s cheaper, but the longer that projects have to hold money and the more they have to put in offsite infrastructure and the riskier they are, the more that money costs. Housing rehab and preservation, that goes back to, we passed another update to the short-term rental regulations that would limit its further expansion. And GO bond, that one will wait. That's basically getting everyone to prepare to invest in this as not only housing for other people, but housing as one of your your pieces of infrastructure like roads and sewers. This is a support for the community and a place for your community to anchor in. And without it, really without full buy-in by your community, it's something that's even more difficult. That's my time.
Thanks,
And then probably
Dustin.
then some. Thank you.
Dustin, I am going to throw you a bone. I want to ask a question that I know you've talked about in previous conversations around the housing production strategy, is that you talked about the importance of community. Nick talked and Steve talked about the importance of showing up and engaging with your electeds, with your planning commission. But, part of this, I think there's this shift. Ethan talked about how traditionally we've done housing land use planning and it really hasn't been specific enough. And the housing production strategy also has some community engagement requirements. And Dustin, can you talk a little bit about like what that meant for Hood River and what your process? I mean, typically when we think of housing or land use process, it's like, there's a 120-day notice. People can file appeals, or there's a public hearing and they can come and say, do we like this development or not? But it's very transactional and kind of reactionary. What did the process look to kind of come to these policies? Obviously, you played a large role in helping shape these, but they were informed by your community. What did that look like?
Yeah, so right off the bat with our council, we always run everything through equity lens, and there's two parts to equity really that we kind of formulaically deal with. One, equity in developing the rules. How do we get people to engage to actually create them? And then equity in the outcomes of the project. How do we see some advancement amongst our community in the rules that actually come out of it, but also giving people agency to see the rules and the process. That's just as important. We went for stakeholder group, we identified sectors, and we put special emphasis in our BIPOC community and second language, maybe not English as primary language, and we leaned into that big way. And we had to really have some agency partners that had long-standing relationships that weren't just because I'm not calling you, this is not performative, this is not so I can check the box. I needed to have some people with some partners that had some long-standing trust relationships. So we had, especially our Spanish-speaking community, our farm community, which really that ag labor housing is a huge issue, to have them not just in a roundtable to be heard, because a lot of times it's not a place that feels like you're very empowered, but we brought them in a Spanish-speaking environment where we were really trying to get them to speak out candidly and just lean into it without fear of being silenced or being the quiet voice. And I think that really resonated in the end with some of the outcomes. And we had people on our task force from the Spanish-speaking community that actually lost their housing during this. And talk about silencing a room of critics when you say, this was our task force, this person no longer has housing from the time that we started to the end. That's some reality that people have to face. And that's a reality of people in our community. So it's hard to talk over that.
Thanks. All right, now we are back to Q&A. So go ahead and raise your hands, keep them held for a second so I can kind of get a queue going.
First of all, I want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. Very important. I'm wondering in terms of the high need right now for people that are homeless. And you'd mentioned the short-term need. So with the pace that we're going, what percentage of the people that are in acute distress right now are we going to be able to remedy? And then in terms of long-term, how long will it take us to get the units that we really need? And I just want to say that, I was sitting here and I was hearing, well, we just want to make progress toward the goal, right? We don't necessarily have to attain the goal, right? We're just trying to make progress. And I've listened to, like city council and people, that work for the city use the same vein of depiction. And I'm a renter, and I've also, been a homeowner and a landlord. But in my neighborhood right now, there's so many homeless people, and it's growing. And then I'm well aware, because I'm an advocate, There's people in our community that are going to be homeless, especially with this 14.6% rent increase that's expected. And so I'm just wondering, you know, do we feel like we're going too slow here for the people? You know, if this was an ambulance trying to get you to the hospital, right, at the rate we're going, and with the, you know, concept that, well, we don't have to make it to the hospital, we just have to be on the way to the hospital. So that this really bothers me. And I really worry about the lives of people that are, you know, falling apart because of what we're doing, or what we're not doing, or, you know, the pacing that we're going. So how can we speed this up? Like,
Money. Yeah. We need money. And I don't think anyone in my position or the people that I work for is satisfied with the pace. I mean, we see the situation getting worse. I don't know if we necessarily feel like we have the means to do anything about it, because it's really a bigger, more expensive, you know, problem than we have. I mean, I could put the entire general fund, every dollar that goes to police, fire, water, sewer, every bit of my agency toward this, and I still couldn't make a dent. It's so much bigger and more expensive than each individual city. And I think that's where we had mentioned this is a funding level that we need partners all the way through the feds. Like it is so far beyond the capital of government on a local level. And this is what frustrates us, I think, is that we're trying to hold ground.
Yeah, you know, I would also say that, remember, government is slow, unfortunately. But there's also reasons for that. It's also due process. We also have to think and understand, develop policies that are responsive. But remember, no city actually, there's not a city employee that goes out and swings a hammer that's building a wall for a home. We are totally subservient to the private sector and nonprofits to build the housing in our community. And so it's largely funding and partnerships. I would also tell you, you know, I had a former city councilor talked to me the other day about a homeless shelter that we're building, and he was opposed to it. He says, if we're going to build it, more are going to come. And I said, no, that's actually not true, because we need to build more housing in our community and keep people in their jobs, keep people in their homes. These vulnerable people, if we keep them in those too, they won't become homeless. So hopefully you have ideally a fixed homeless population. It's a vexing issue. You are on it. You are not wrong.
Yeah, just in response to the rate of production, right? 584,000 units over 20 years. That means we need to double market rate production and triple affordable housing production. That's going to take a lot of effort and funding and investment and prioritization and teamwork. And I think when we talk about making progress towards that goal, not holding ourselves to account and say, did we meet that goal? And if we didn't, then it was a failure. You know, making progress is really, really good progress, and that's a win. But, you know, of course, there's always going to be more to do in that regard. And I think it just takes commitment, leadership, and, you know, making, you know, these folks over here are in every single day in the trenches in terms of, you know, having those conversations with people, having those really hard conversations about, can we get this actually built? But it to some extent out of their hands, and they can only do so much. And so that's where things like state coordination, things like federal investments are really key to, you know, pushing that conversation even further.
Hi, Jackie Keogh from Core Land Trust in Central Oregon. So speaking on partnerships and money, nonprofit developers like us are not motivated to build in areas like this because of the lack of local funding that we would have to turn down from a bigger city that we could build in. Recognizing that we still want to build in these areas. So how are you all working to help create partnerships and private investments, whether it's from a major employer or from a market rate developer who could be motivated to some voluntary inclusionary zoning, so that we can so our pro formas pencil to build affordable housing in those communities.
So in terms of, we have preferential policies towards fees up to affordable housing, and affordable housing that maintains its affordability, which usually makes everyone a little squeamish, when you start deed restricting things. Now, the land trust oftentimes has that built into its mission. When it comes to, really process, it's unfortunate that you have to get in line with everyone else because we're on the shot clock. It doesn't matter whether you're truly profit motivated or not. I'm stuck with the same piece. But when it comes to those arrangements, Rand Road, we're going to buy property and we're going to go up for RFQs. We're looking for people that are mission driven on that same mission, and we're going to we're a partner in that. I mean, and not just token, like we bought dirt. Like I bought really expensive dirt that was really unready because we believe in this. And so we put our money where our mouth is. We're the first city in Oregon to voluntarily pass a middle housing code that expedites small dwelling units and 0 lot sizes, all ministerial, all without land use decisions, because that's me stepping up saying, you know what, I'll make a way for you to do it. If you're going to build a house under 1,200 square feet, you're going to make it available. I'm going to make it really easy for you to show up and do it. So I'm going to take the risk out. Where I can't put money in is I can understand there's risk and there's time, and that's your money. So I think understanding that relationship and really, in a philosophical sense, seeing some partnership that these things just can't, live in silos, that there is some overlap there. So we're available. We try to show up and where we can in those places. And I think understanding that, and in a lot of ways, attitude, I think means a lot. So if we're mission driven in the same sense, we're going to see those things happen and show up. So that's something that we do. I don't know. What do you do, Steve?
I would just say I think Nick nailed it before and said urban renewal. I think that's the biggest tool that we have. And I think in that regard, from the affordable housing side, partnering with the taxation districts and educating them on the benefit of affordable housing as part of urban renewal. Because they're just they're seeing it like a park. They're seeing it as not assessed value of the future. And so I think educating them on that and getting them in your corner, and that's what we've seen in urban renewal. And so that would be the piece I'd say.
All right, thank you. We have a question in the chat from our online participants. This is a specific question to Dustin on Hood River's construction excise tax. To Dustin, is the residential CET in Hood River 1%? There's several questions. So I'm going to ask them all, and I'll help you if you forget them.
Yes.
Yes, it is 1%. Is affordable housing development exempt?
It can be exempted with the request. So there is an opportunity for it to be exempt.
Okay. Have any cities or counties considered a tiered CET in which values over, say, 500,000 have a higher CET?
If I can get anything under 500,000, I'd be happy. So I think that might have worked in 2015, but it's 2022 and affordable housing is $500,000 now. So I think there are people that have evaluated a more tiered and nuanced system. Yes, that is the case.
Okay, thank you. All right, and then I'm going to go to a live question.
Hi. So yesterday I was actually in this room with one of the presenters who was here, and they were talking about a lot of houselessness that occurs in recreational counties, and speaking towards places like Hood River, where there's a lot of short-term rentals, and that's generally an income revenue that renters don't have access to. And so I was just kind of curious if there's any strategies or any thought on the idea of incentivizing homeowners to allow renters or partner with their renters in a way that they could generate revenue and also kind of get them a way to make their housing affordable and almost be an owner in that regard.
We have that not so much on the city led, but more on the industry led. Mount Hood Meadows for one. provides incentives for people to house their employees. So there's an industry that is stepping up and saying, our employees, our human resource and assets there's an advantage to help people in the community who have homes house these folks who work and live here and usually serve them when they're up there playing. They are the ones really stepping up to make that happen. We also see Boeing in the drone industry and for the aerospace industry also step up and do master leases. I wish sometimes they would invest in larger format affordable housing projects, but they do position themselves amongst existing homeowners so that they can have kind of turnkey leases on properties that allow them to place their employees. So there is that naturally occurring relationship, really industry driven. So,
Other questions? All right, I was worried we were going to run out of time. So maybe some of the questions you had earlier were answered. Hopefully that was the case. I'll turn it back to the panel. Ethan, the rest of you, thank you for staying on time. Any other thoughts or points you want, takeaways you'd want the audience to understand around housing production strategies, city's role on this? Go ahead, Nick.
Remember that these are only a 10-year strategy, right? 8 years. So, I mean, as I look at the difference between the current methodology or the past methodology of housing needs analysis versus the housing production strategy, these are shorter term plans that are more action oriented, that in 2022, you're going to identify some problems, and then 2030, you'll look at new sets of problems and respond to that. I don't think we quite appreciate that ability to pivot or to even change your plans and policies, whereas lots of cities have very, very old comprehensive plan policies related to housing and of course their housing needs analysis that they don't touch for 10, 15 years. So one of the benefits of the housing production strategy is to be a lot more nimble and more responsive over the long term. You can't put a price value on that, but I do think as we start to see progress in the communities, you start to learn about what is working to create new housing on the ground, and what is still what those remaining barriers are. I think we're going to have better understanding, be able to respond to that more effectively moving forward. So I'm actually more optimistic about goal 10 than I ever have been.
I got one quick thing. If you expect something to be different, like we talk about all this change and how we want change and see this as, as a kind of a new era and enlightened era of how we do this, we're going to have to make difficult choices. And I think the expectation that have a different outcome by doing the same thing, I think is kind of a fool's errand. And I oftentimes remind the folks in my sphere of influence that, we may have to do some uncomfortable things. And it may feel dangerous. It may feel like we're stepping out and really defying what feels like the norm in our safe place. And that's probably what is going to be necessary for us to see change. And I think that's, kind of that reminder to be daring and to be bold. And those are going to be kind of those intangibles that become necessary to see things occur differently. And I think that can be scary. That can be a scary place for a community of small folks who, our elected officials, they're volunteers. They're not, some high statute of like well compensated. I think they make $50, and they're up there really making these hard decisions, and they're really being pressed to do courageous things. And I think to instill that sense of agency in them and to be bold, I think that's something that beyond all the economics becomes really important as a community to go shoulder to shoulder together to see these things happen.
Any other questions? Because I've got one that I was going to pose. So.
And we have one online too. So let me do the online one and then I'll go to you. Okay, another question online. It's for you, Ethan. Many Oregon cities and counties have high rates of homes utilized as second vacation or investment empty homes. They said examples 27% in Lincoln County, 15% in Deschutes, 38% Tillamook. This is 2017 data on second homes. How can DLCD ensure that housing production strategy needs align with Goal 10, housing development to provide homes for residents?
Yeah, so the statute and the process by which cities calculate housing need doesn't include things like second home and vacation rentals. So part of what needs to change in that regard is that in order to get to a true housing need, like how many homes do you actually need, knowing that some of those are going to be potentially siphoned off as vacation and rental options, how do we incorporate that into that conversation of, okay, we're looking 20 years in the future, what does our housing stock look like? How do we incorporate that element into the decisions we make and the policy decisions we make to facilitate production of our needed housing? Not to say that vacation and second homes are needed housing, but they are a part of the housing need in a community because they do compete for the same resources. So, when we're talking about the strategies that a city implements to accommodate their housing need, maybe one of those is to regulate short-term rentals similar to Hood River and Seaside and other places do, so that you can actually see those important long-term rentals in your community and you're not just allowing those to just be absorbed into short-term rentals. So I think it's moving into a better understanding, or I guess maybe a more realistic estimation of housing need and the amount of housing units needed over time is what's necessary, so that we don't, we're not just blind to it, because it's a very real, has a very real impact on, 20-year growth.
Hi, thanks for the panel. It's been great. I'm Teresa Diebel, and I'm just wondering on the last chart that was up, the direct project subsidy, how you're approaching that and thinking about that through partnerships or other, potential sources there.
Some of that is, like we mentioned, the waiver of fees, deferrals of system development charges, or backfilling those. Oftentimes it can be building infrastructure. So we keep mentioning the urban renewal. The urban renewal agency has the right to spend money, and sometimes it takes, building a road. Sometimes these projects require to build signalization. An ODOT signal can be $3 million on the front end. That does nothing other than make that house or that development buildable. That also can just cripple a pro forma, especially of an income restricted area. So partnering, we can see that as direct project subsidy. We will most likely end up giving away real estate as our contribution. That writes down that first end, then improves that pro forma of those projects. Those are direct, that's direct participation in a project. With those, that is now, we're starting to look at what we refer to capital A affordable housing. That project, which is marketed to a specified income group and maintained in perpetuity. That's where I think we have a policy that those are the direct project subsidies that are angled towards that particular need, because we see it as that acute and that underserved by the market.
Mariana Crawford, Keller Silvis and Associates. I have a simple question. What is the population of Hood River and Madras, please?
Hood River, daytime population, 8,800. Weekend population, I don't know. Depends on if it's sunny and breezy, like 20,000. So 8,800 population.
So you're considered rural?
I don't know, maybe.
By
I'm
the
under 10,000.
USDA?
That's I think
Yes,
I think
you
we would be a rural community.
Okay, thank you.
Madras is 7,700 people.
Thank you.
We consider ourselves rural, even though we're part of Central Oregon. We're an hour from Bend, the major population center.
Thank you very much.
For the purposes of state regulation and thresholds, both of those cities would be classified as a small city. And then cities between 10,000 and 25,000 would be a medium-sized city, and then 25 and above is a large city. Under, just how cities, the requirements for planning shake out.
Thank you. For USDA purposes, it's 40,000 and less.
All right, we can take one more question. If anyone has anything. Kim?
This question is for Leslie, who was sitting next to me but had to leave early. She wanted to know about some good examples of working with your county government if there are parcels of land that are zoned appropriately and could provide for some needed housing. Do you have any, either good examples or recommendations for how to improve that relationship to see the needed housing be developed?
If you have any, our county has a CET as well, construction excise tax. They used it to buy property adjacent to property that the city bought. So when we went out for our developer qualifications, we collaborated with them. Again, the housing issue is not just a city or county issue in Hood River. It's countywide. So we worked with them to try to combine those acquired piece of parcels and really try to align that those projects and those holdings together. So that's really an ongoing relationship. Again, I don't think that's a project. That's a program, and that's relationship building to just be whether they become an impacted taxing body, whether they have real estate, whether they have means, whether they have needs. That's something that I think the success is built over time. That they know where we're coming from and that we have kind of understand each other's mission.
I wish I had examples.
All right. Yeah. So I will share from the LOC's perspective in terms of counties. We are partnering really closely with the Association of Oregon Counties as well in terms of looking at what do we want to advocate for at the state level, looking at the next legislative session. And I can tell you it's absolutely infrastructure and connecting the dots, as Nick was talking about, from infrastructure, those resources to needed housing, aligning funds, aligning timelines at the state level seems really critical. And there's a number of other issues that we kind of talked a little bit about today. So if you're curious, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm also happy to help connect you with county folks or locals. I want to thank everyone on the panel, the experts today, Ethan, Dustin, Nick, and Steve. Thank you all for being here. And if you have questions about housing production strategies in your community or communities you're looking to build, Ethan is an amazing resource on the timelines, the general structure, and can get you in contact with the right folks. So I want to encourage you to reach out to him. Thanks, everybody.